My name is Nadia. I'm 18 years old. And at my birthday dinner last night, while my parents were giving speeches about family and my sister was calculating what she would buy first, I was sitting quietly at the table knowing that everything they were planning was already out of reach. They just did not know that yet. The dinner was at Ardennes, the kind of restaurant where the menu does not list prices and the lighting is designed to make everyone look like a better version of themselves. My mother had made the reservation 3 weeks earlier. She had mentioned it 4 times in the days leading up to it, which was 4 more times than she had mentioned any of my previous 17 birthdays combined. I noticed that. My father wore the jacket he saved for occasions he considered important. He had not worn it to my school graduation. He had not worn it to the scholarship dinner last spring when I had been recognized in front of 300 people. He was wearing it tonight, at a restaurant on a Tuesday, for a birthday he had never previously treated as requiring formal attire. I noticed that, too. My younger sister Jade sat across from me in a dress she had bought that afternoon. I knew this because she had texted me a photograph of it at 2 p.m. with the caption, "Found something for tonight," accompanied by a price tag emoji I had learned over 16 years, meant she was pleased with herself in a way that had something to do with money. Jade was 15 and had the confidence of someone who had never been told no in a language she could not negotiate her way around. The table was arranged so that my parents sat on either side of me, and Jade sat directly across. A configuration my mother had requested from the host, I realized, that put me at the center of the table, in the way a subject rather than a guest occupies the center of a room. The bread arrived. The water was poured. My father ordered a bottle of wine he described to the sommelier as something appropriate for a celebration and smiled at me when he said it, with the warm pride of a man performing warm pride for an audience of 1. I smiled back. I was very good at smiling back. Before I tell you what happened after the bread and the wine and the celebration smile, I need to take you back. Because the dinner was not the beginning of the story. It was the last scene of a very long setup that my family had been running since the day my grandfather died and the paperwork arrived that told them what he had left behind. If you enjoy stories about quiet intelligence arriving before anyone realizes the danger is past, you are exactly where you need to be. This is Revenge Cold Stories. Subscribe before we go further and tell me your first name and your city in the comments. I want to know who is in this room tonight. Now let me take you back. My grandfather's name was Edmund Cole. He had built a logistics company in the 1970s from a single truck and a contact book, and the stubborn intelligence of a man who understood that the most valuable thing in any supply chain was reliability, and who had spent 40 years being the most reliable person his clients had ever worked with. By the time I was born, the company had been sold, and the proceeds had been invested and managed with the same stubborn intelligence that had built it. Edmund was not flashy. He drove a 12-year-old sedan and wore the same style of watch for 30 years, and lived in the house he had bought in 1981, and never saw a reason to leave. He died when I was 14. He left me everything. Not my parents, not my sister, not the extended family who had been circling his estate for years with the specific attentiveness of people who have confused proximity to wealth with entitlement to it. Me, his oldest grandchild, in a trust structured so that it became fully accessible on my 18th birthday. The amount was significant. I am not going to state the number here because the number is not the point. The point is what the number meant to different people. To me, it meant something my grandfather had spent years trying to teach me. To my family, it meant something they had been planning since the day the will was read. Those were not the same thing. My grandfather started talking to me about money when I was 9 years old, not in the way adults talk to children about money, which is usually a brief lesson about saving that dissolves before anyone has to act on it, in the way he talked about everything, which was directly, and with the assumption that I was capable of understanding what he was actually saying if he said it clearly enough. He would bring me to his office on Saturday mornings when I was between 10 and 13. His office was a room in his house lined with bookshelves and a desk that looked like it had been there since the house was built. He would make 2 cups of tea and set one in front of me, and we would sit at the desk and he would show me things. Investment statements, property records, trust documents, the annual reports of companies he had invested in, and the annual reports of companies he had chosen not to invest in, and the reasons for both decisions written in his handwriting in a notebook he kept specifically for that purpose. He said, "I want you to understand how this works before you need to understand it." I was 11. I said, "Why me?" He looked at me over his teacup and said, "Because you pay attention." He did not say this as a compliment exactly. He said it as an observation, the way you note a useful quality in someone you are going to rely on. I paid attention. He had noticed. He was going to use it. Over the next 3 years, he taught me the basic architecture of wealth management, not the technical language, though some of that came with it. The principles, the difference between an asset and a liability, the difference between income and wealth, the difference between what something is worth and what someone will pay for it, the way compound growth works over time, and why patience is not a personality trait in finance but a strategy. And then one Saturday, when I was 13, 6 months before he died, he said something I've thought about every day since. He said, "Money changes people fastest when they think it belongs to them." He was looking at the window when he said it, not at me. At the garden outside where the light was coming through the leaves in the way it came through in late September. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "When people learn there is money available that they believe they have a claim to, they change. Not dramatically, quietly. They start making decisions as if the money is already theirs. They start planning around it. They start seeing the person who holds it differently. Not as a person, as an obstacle between them and the thing they have already decided belongs to them." I said, "Is that going to happen?" He said, "Yes." I said, "To who?" He looked at me then. He said, "To everyone except you, if you are careful." He died 7 months later. The will was read 3 weeks after the funeral. My parents sat across from the estate attorney in a room that smelled like paper and expensive carpet, and they listened to the trust structure being explained with the expressions of people receiving information that requires immediate reprocessing of several years of assumptions. I sat beside them and watched their faces. My grandfather had been right about the changing. It started that afternoon. My mother had never been particularly interested in my opinions. I want to be precise about this because the story requires precision, and imprecision would make it the wrong story. She was not a cold woman. She loved her daughters in the way she understood love, which was organizational and logistical and expressed through the management of appearances rather than the navigation of interior lives. She arranged things. She maintained things. She presented the family to the world in the way she believed the world should see it. What she had never done with particular consistency was ask me what I thought. My sister Jade occupied a different position in the family's emotional architecture. She was the younger one, the easier one, in the sense that she wanted what my mother wanted her to want and expressed herself in ways my mother found legible. Jade was loud and social and interested in the things that translated well into the family's public presentation. She was, in the vocabulary my mother used without saying it directly, the daughter who fit. I was the daughter who paid attention. These were not the same thing, and in our family the difference between them had consequences. After the will was read, the attention my mother paid to my opinions increased measurably. She began asking how I felt about things. She began including me in conversations she had previously conducted as though I were a supporting character rather than a participant. She began finding reasons to spend time with me individually, which had not previously been a priority. I noted each instance without comment. My father's change was different. He had always been warmer with me than my mother, in the distracted way of a man whose primary emotional vocabulary was physical presence rather than verbal engagement. He showed up. He attended things. He did not frequently say anything that required remembering. After the will, he became interested in my plans. Where did I want to go to college? What did I want to study? Had I thought about what I would do with the resources I would have access to when I turned 18? He said resources with the care of someone who has practiced using a word that feels natural. I said I had been thinking about it. He said it would be good to have a plan. I said I agreed. I did not say that the plan was already in progress. 3 weeks before my 18th birthday, I called the attorney, not the estate attorney who had read the will, a different one, a woman named Patricia Holt, who had been recommended by a contact my grandfather had listed in the notebook he left me along with everything else. A page near the back in his handwriting, "People I trust." Patricia Holt's name was on it with a phone number and 2 words beneath it, "Call her." I had been carrying that notebook since the funeral. Patricia's office was downtown. I took the bus on a Thursday afternoon and sat across from her desk and explained what I wanted to do. She listened without interrupting, which was the first quality I noted about her. And then she asked 3 precise questions about the trust structure and my understanding of its terms and my intentions for what I was proposing. I answered all 3 correctly. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating their expectations of a person they have just met. Then she said, "Your grandfather prepared you well." I said, "He did." She said, "What you are describing is entirely within your rights as the sole beneficiary. We can execute this before your 18th birthday. The restructuring will move the assets into a private, irrevocable trust with you as sole trustee and sole beneficiary. Once it is done, no external party has access or withdrawal authority without your explicit written consent." I said, "How long will it take?" She said, "I can have documents ready by next week." I said, "I would like them ready before the 14th. My birthday was the 15th. She said, "Understood." The documents were signed on the 13th, a Thursday afternoon, Patricia's office, 2 witnesses, my signature on 17 pages of language I had read 3 times before I arrived because my grandfather had taught me to read documents before I signed them, and I had never stopped. When the last page was signed, Patricia organized the folder and handed me a copy and said, "As of midnight tonight, these assets are in the trust under your sole control." I put the folder in my bag. I thanked her. I took the bus home. The birthday dinner the following evening had the quality I had been anticipating since the reservation was made. My parents were performing warmth with the sustained energy of people who have been rehearsing. My father ordered the good wine. My mother had arranged for the restaurant to bring a small cake with a candle. Jade was wearing the dress she had bought that afternoon. The conversation moved in the direction the conversations move when people have an agenda and are managing the pace of its arrival. My mother said families should never keep secrets from each other. She said it warmly, looking at me across the table in the tone she used when she was saying something she had decided was important and was framing it as universal rather than targeted. I said, "I agree." She smiled. I smiled back. The bread arrived. The wine was poured. My father made a toast about the future and what it held and the role of family in navigating it successfully. Jade raised her glass with the expression of someone who has already spent money she has not received. I raised my glass. I drank. I said nothing. Later that night, after the dinner and the drive home and the birthday cake my mother had also arranged in the kitchen as a second celebration, I went to my room and set my bag on the desk and looked at the folder inside it. My phone showed 2 alerts from an account monitoring service. Login attempt, unrecognized device. I looked at the alerts for a moment, then I put the phone down and thought about my grandfather's voice in his office on a Saturday morning in September. Money changes people fastest when they think it belongs to them. The dinner had not been about my birthday. I had understood that before I sat down. What I understood now, looking at the login alerts on my phone, was that they had not waited until morning. They had started at 11:47, 13 minutes before midnight, 13 minutes before they believed the money would be accessible. It had not been accessible. It had not been accessible since Thursday, but they did not know that yet. And the morning was going to be a different kind of conversation entirely. The alert stopped at 12:43 in the morning. I know because I was awake when they stopped, not from anxiety, from the particular alertness of someone who has been expecting a thing to happen and is tracking it as it happens with the focused attention of a person who understands that what they are witnessing is information. 7 login attempts across 2 accounts, all from the same IP address. The IP address resolved to my parents' home network, which was the network I had grown up on, and which I had removed my devices from 3 weeks earlier when I switched to my own plan. I noted the timestamps. I screenshotted each alert. I saved them in a folder I had created on a cloud account my family did not know existed, organized by date the way my grandfather had organized his notebooks, chronological, factual, without editorializing. Then I turned off my lamp and lay in the dark and thought about 13 minutes. They had started at 11:47. 13 minutes before midnight, 13 minutes before the trust was scheduled, in their understanding, to become accessible. They had not waited until the morning. They had not waited until a reasonable hour. They had sat somewhere in the house, my parents or my sister or some combination of the three, and at 11:47 they had attempted to access money that did not belong to them. That was not curiosity. That was a plan that had been waiting for a date. I thought about my grandfather's notebook, the page near the back with Patricia Holt's name and phone number, and the 2 words beneath it. Caller. He had known this was coming with enough certainty to write instructions for addressing it before I would need them. He had been right about the changing. He had just underestimated the timeline. I came downstairs at 7:15. My mother was in the kitchen in her robe making coffee with the morning ease of someone who had slept well, which told me she had not been the one at the computer at 11:47. Or she had been, and had no awareness that the attempts had been logged. She looked up when I came in and smiled with the warmth that had been calibrated over the preceding months and said, "Happy birthday, sweetheart," as if she had forgotten she had said it 6 times the previous evening. I said thank you and poured coffee. My father appeared from the hallway in the pressed manner of a man who had been awake for a while and had dressed before coming downstairs. He kissed me on the top of my head, a gesture he had not previously made with any frequency, and said something about the day being a big one. I said it was. Jade came down at 7:40 with the energy she had when something she had been anticipating was about to arrive. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone and did not look at me, which was different from her usual habit of looking at me with the peripheral assessment she had been running since the will was read. She was looking at her phone with the concentration of someone who is waiting for a notification. I sat across from her. I drank my coffee. I waited. The first move came from my father. He leaned against the counter with his mug and said, in the tone he used for things he had practiced saying casually, "So I was thinking we should probably sit down at some point today and talk about the financial transition." I said, "Sure." He said, "Just so we are all on the same page about how things will work going forward." I said, "That sounds reasonable." My mother joined in from the stove where she was making eggs with a level of domestic investment she did not usually bring to weekday mornings. She said something about family being a team and how the coming years would be easier if everyone approached them as a unit. I said, "I agree." Jade finally looked up from her phone. She said, "Did you check your accounts this morning?" I looked at her. I said, "Not yet." She looked back at her phone. The eggs were served. The coffee was refilled. The conversation moved through several topics with the careful surface management of a family that is saving the actual subject for a moment when the conditions feel right. I ate my eggs. I said nothing that was not required. I was learning something about patience from the people who had been practicing it on me for 4 years. The family attorney called at 9:47. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he had been my parents' attorney for 12 years. He called my phone, not theirs, which told me they had given him my number and asked him to make contact, which told me the attorney call was part of the sequence they had planned. I let it go to voicemail. His message was professional and warm and suggested we schedule a meeting at my earliest convenience to discuss the trust transition and ensure everything was set up correctly from a legal standpoint. I saved the voicemail in the cloud folder with the login alerts. Then I called Patricia. She answered on the second ring. I said, "The family attorney called this morning." She said, "Gerald Marsh." I said, "You know him." She said, "I know of him. He handles estate matters for several families in the area. He is competent and he works for whoever is paying him. Right now, that is your parents." I said, "What will he tell them when they ask him to review the trust?" She said that the restructuring is legal, irrevocable, and that you are the sole controlling authority. He will also tell them that there is no mechanism through which they can access the assets without your written consent and no legal basis on which to challenge the restructuring, given that you executed it as the sole beneficiary of your majority age. I said, "And if they push," She said, then they will spend money on attorneys to be told the same thing more expensively. I said, I will call you if anything develops. She said, I expected you would. The conversation my father had been building toward happened at 11 in the morning at the kitchen table. He sat across from me. My mother sat beside him. Jade was notably absent, which meant she had been asked to be elsewhere, which meant my parents had decided this was an adult conversation and Jade's presence would complicate the performance they had prepared. My father opened with family. He talked about what family meant in practical terms, about shared foundations and mutual support, and the way wealth worked best when it was approached as a collective resource rather than an individual one. He said these things in the voice he had been developing since October, the warm, authoritative voice of a man who believes he is being reasonable and wants credit for the reasonableness. My mother added the emotional layer. She talked about sacrifice, about the years of raising 2 daughters and the investments of time and energy and love that had gone into the people those daughters had become. She said it the way she had clearly rehearsed it, with the specific cadence of something that had been shaped through repetition into its most persuasive form. I listened to all of it. Then my father said, so what we were thinking was that it would make sense to establish a shared account structure, something that gives the family access to the resources as they are needed while you maintain your long-term holdings. I said, what kind of access? He said, just for family expenses, for the things that come up. I said, like what? A pause. The pause of someone who had not prepared for the follow-up question because they had expected the first answer to be yes. My mother said, your father's business has been going through a transition. There are some obligations that need addressing. We thought it would be practical to have a conversation about how we handle those as a family. I said, what kind of obligations? My father said some investment positions that have not performed the way we anticipated. A refinancing situation on the house. I said, what kind of refinancing situation? He set his coffee down. He said, we took out a second mortgage 18 months ago to cover some opportunities that did not materialize. The payment structure is more demanding than we planned for. I held that information. A second mortgage, 18 months ago, 6 months after the will was read and the inheritance amount became known. They had borrowed against the house on the assumption that the inheritance would cover the debt when I turned 18. They had not told me. They had borrowed money they expected to repay with mine. I said, I did not know about the mortgage. My mother said, we did not want to worry you while you were finishing school. I said, how much? My father said the number. It was significant, less than the inheritance, but structured in a way that, had I not executed the trust restructuring, would have been accessible through the accounts they had attempted to reach at 11:47 the previous night. I sat with that for a moment. The dinner the night before with its expensive restaurant and its good wine and its speeches about family unity had been funded, I now understood, with money borrowed against a debt my parents intended to pay with mine. The birthday celebration had been purchased on a credit against my future. I said, I need to make a call. My father said, Nadia. I said, I will be back in a few minutes. I went upstairs. I called Patricia from my room with the door closed. I told her about the second mortgage and the amount and the timeline. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, they leveraged the house in anticipation of the inheritance. I said, that is what it appears. She said, that is not your legal obligation. The trust restructuring means those debts are entirely separate from your assets. There is no mechanism through which their mortgage creates a claim on the trust. I said, I know. I want to understand my position clearly before I go back downstairs. She said, your position is clear. You owe them nothing legally. What you choose to do personally is a different question and one only you can answer. I said, I understand. She said, there is one more thing I want to mention. The login attempts last night will be relevant if this becomes contentious. They established that an attempt was made to access your accounts without authorization before the trust restructuring was publicly known. That is useful information to have on record. I said, it is already documented. A pause. She said, your grandfather really did prepare you well. I said, he prepared me for exactly this. I went back downstairs. My parents were still at the table. The coffee had gone cold. My father had his hands flat on the surface, in the way he sat when he was prepared to continue a conversation he believed he could still direct. I sat across from them. I said, I want to be clear about something before we continue this conversation. They waited. I said, the inheritance is in a private, irrevocable trust. I restructured it last week. I am the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. There is no shared access and no external withdrawal authority. My mother said, what does that mean? I said, it means what I said. The assets are protected. No one can access them without my explicit written consent. My father said, Nadia, we are your parents. I said, I know. He said, we are talking about family resources. I said, no, we are talking about my grandfather's resources. He left them to me, not to the family, to me. And he spent 4 years making sure I understood the difference. My mother's expression shifted in the way expressions shift when a performance has encountered something it was not built to manage. She said, after everything we have done for you. I said, I know that sentence. I have been expecting it. She said, you are being cruel. I said, I am being clear. Those are not the same thing. My father said, the mortgage. I said, the mortgage is your obligation. You took it without telling me. You planned to resolve it with money you assumed would be accessible. That assumption was incorrect. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, not anger. The specific expression of a man who has just understood that the person he thought he was negotiating with had already resolved the negotiation before the conversation began. He said, when did you do this? I said, Thursday. He said, before your birthday. I said, yes. The kitchen was very quiet. Jade appeared in the doorway. She had been listening from the hallway. She said, wait, you already moved everything. I looked at her. I said, yes. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, when did you know? I thought about a Saturday morning in my grandfather's office, tea going warm on the desk, a notebook open between us, a man who had built something from nothing looking at his granddaughter with the attention of someone who had been watching carefully and had decided to trust what he saw. I said, I have known for a long time. The kitchen stayed quiet for longer than was comfortable. My father's hands were still flat on the table. My mother was looking at the space between us rather than at me, which was the expression she used when she was processing something that required reorganizing a significant amount of prior understanding. Jade had not moved from the doorway. Outside, the morning was doing what mornings do in mid-October, arriving with the thin, clear light that makes everything look slightly more permanent than it feels. My father said finally, you planned this. I said, yes. He said, before the birthday. I said, I just told you that. He said, we are your family. I said, I know. That is not the same as having access to my accounts. He stood up, not with anger, or not only with anger, with the restless energy of a man whose understanding of a situation has just been structurally revised and whose body has not yet decided what to do with that revision. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room. My mother said, your grandfather put you up to this. I said, my grandfather has been dead for 4 years. She said, he poisoned you against us. All those Saturdays in his office, all that time he spent filling your head with suspicion. I said, he spent that time teaching me how money works. Those are not the same thing. She said, he never trusted this family. I said, I think he understood this family clearly. There is a difference. That landed the way truth lands when it arrives in a form no one can argue with, not loudly, just completely. Jade finally moved from the doorway. She sat at the table in the chair she always used, and she looked at me with an expression I had not seen from her before. Not the smug confidence of the previous evening, something more stripped down, the expression of a 15-year-old who had been told a particular story about how her life was going to go, and has just understood that the story had a flaw in it. She said, so what happens now? I said, that depends on what everyone decides to do. I called Patricia from my room that afternoon and gave her a full account of the morning conversation. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, the mortgage is the primary pressure point. They will return to it because it is the one concrete obligation they cannot reframe as a relationship issue. It is a financial reality with a payment schedule and consequences if the payments are not met. I said, "What are my options?" She said, "You have several. You could decline to engage and allow them to resolve it independently. You could offer a structured loan with formal terms. You could offer to purchase the property at market value, which would retire the mortgage and give them liquidity but would change the ownership structure entirely. Or you could do nothing and observe how they manage it." I said, "Which would my grandfather recommend?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I knew Edmund for 11 years. He would tell you to separate the financial question from the emotional one and address each on its own terms. He would say that giving money to people who plan to take it is not generosity, but he would also say that watching people you care about struggle when you have the means to help is not strength. It is stubbornness wearing strength's clothing." I said, "That sounds like him." She said, "He talked about you often. He said you were the one who would ask the right question." I said, "What was the right question?" She said, "Not what can I do? What should I do?" He said, "Most people never get past the first one." I sat with that for a while after I hung up. 3 days passed. My parents did not raise the mortgage again directly. They moved into a phase of careful distance that I recognized as the specific behavior of people who have made a demand and been refused and are now recalculating their approach. My mother was polite in the organized way she was polite when she was managing something. My father was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was thinking. Jade was different. She came to my room on the second evening and knocked, which she did not usually do, and asked if she could come in. I said yes. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed, which was how she had always sat in my room since she was small, and she looked at the wall and said, "Did you know they were going to try to access the accounts?" I said, "I suspected." She said, "But you did not tell me." I said, "What would you have done if I had told you?" She thought about that. She said, "I do not know." "I think I would have told them." I said, "I know." She said, "I knew about the mortgage." I said, "I know you knew." She said, "Mom told me last summer." She said, "When you turned 18, everything would be easier." I said, "Easier for whom?" She looked at the wall. She said, "I did not ask that question." I said, "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did Grandpa talk about me?" I said, "He loved you. He worried about you in a different way than he worried about me." She said, "What way?" I said, "He thought you had been given things before you understood what things cost. He thought it was not your fault, but that it would become your problem eventually." She said, "Was he right?" I looked at my 15-year-old sister sitting on my floor with her back against the bed and the smug confidence entirely gone from her face, and what remained was something younger and more honest than anything I had seen from her in years. I said, "I think you are going to have to decide that." She said nothing else. But she stayed for another hour, and we talked about other things, school and a book she had been reading and a friend's situation that had been bothering her, and it was the most honest conversation we had had in as long as I could remember. When she left, she paused at the door. She said, "I am sorry about the birthday thing." "The dress." I said, "The dress was fine." She said, "You know what I mean." I said, "I do. Thank you." She closed the door. I made a decision on the 4th day, not from guilt. I want to be precise about that, not from the old reflex of the overlooked child who resolves conflict by making herself useful, from the considered assessment of someone who has separated the financial question from the emotional one the way Patricia had described and has addressed each on its own terms. The financial question was the mortgage. The emotional question was what kind of relationship I wanted with my family going forward. These were not the same question, and they did not require the same answer. I called Patricia. I said, "I want to structure a formal loan, the full mortgage amount, market rate interest, a written agreement with a payment schedule and clear terms for what happens if the schedule is not met, independent legal documentation." She said, "Not a gift." I said, "Not a gift, a loan, with paperwork." She said, "Why the distinction?" I said, "Because a gift would be responding to manipulation with capitulation and calling it generosity. A loan is a transaction between adults with clear terms. It treats them as capable of meeting an obligation rather than incapable of managing without my subsidy." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Edmund would have approved of that answer." I said, I know. She said, I will have the documents ready by end of week. I presented the loan documents to my parents on a Saturday morning, not at the kitchen table. In Patricia's office, which had been my choice and which communicated something about the register of the conversation before anyone said a word. Patricia sat at the end of the table. I sat across from my parents. The documents were organized and clearly labeled and had been prepared with the professional care of someone who understood that clarity was the only form of this conversation that served anyone. My father read the terms with the expression of a man reading something he had not expected. My mother said, "This is very formal." I said, "It is a legal agreement. Formal is appropriate." She said, "We are your parents." I said, "I know. The formality is not because of what you are to me. It is because clear agreements protect relationships better than assumptions do." My father looked up from the documents. He said, "Market rate interest." I said, "Yes." He said, "A payment schedule." I said, "Yes. Designed to be manageable based on your current income." Patricia helped structure the timeline. He said, "And if we cannot meet a payment," I said, "we renegotiate the schedule." The terms include a provision for that. Missing a payment is not a crisis. It is a conversation. He looked at the document for another moment. Then he said something I had not expected. He said, "Your grandfather would have done this." I said, "I know. I learned it from him." He picked up the pen. He signed. My mother signed after him, with the specific quality of someone who is accepting terms they did not expect and have not finished deciding how they feel about but understand are fair. The months that followed were quieter than the preceding years. Not cold. Quiet in the way of a relationship that has found a more honest register after the performance has been set aside. My parents met their payments. My mother called on Sundays with a quality of attention that was less managed than it had been. My father asked about my plans without the agenda of someone assessing access. Jade turned 16 in the spring. I took her to lunch, just the two of us, at a restaurant she chose. She talked about a business idea she had been thinking about, a small resale operation she wanted to start with items she sourced at estate sales. She had done the math. She wanted my opinion. I told her the numbers worked if she kept the overhead controlled and the margins honest. She took notes on her phone. She said, "Will you help me set it up properly?" I said, "I will teach you to set it up yourself." She said, "That is what Grandpa would have said." I said, "I know." 8 months after the birthday dinner, I sat at the desk in my apartment with the trust documents in front of me and the city visible through the window and the early morning light doing what it did in the first hour after sunrise, arriving at an angle that made the ordinary look considered. I was enrolled in a finance program at the university. I had a clear schedule and a clear plan and a relationship with my family that was more honest than it had ever been and less warm in certain ways than I had once wished it was. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and I had stopped trying to resolve the tension between them into something simpler than it was. My grandfather had not prepared me to be comfortable. He had prepared me to be clear. Those were not the same thing, and the difference had cost me something and given me something, and I was still in the process of understanding the full weight of both. I thought about what Patricia had said, that Edmund talked about me often, that he had said I was the one who would ask the right question. I had asked it, not what can I do? What should I do? The answer had not been simple. It had been honest, and honest was the only foundation anything real could be built on. At my 18th birthday dinner, my family performed warmth while planning to access an inheritance that was no longer accessible. I had moved the assets into a private, irrevocable trust 3 days before the dinner after 4 years of preparation, guided by a grandfather who had understood exactly what would happen when I turned 18. My family made 7 login attempts at 11:47 the night of the dinner. The next morning they told me about a second mortgage they had taken in anticipation of the inheritance. I offered a formal loan with clear terms and market rate interest. They signed. The payments have been met. My sister is building something of her own. I am enrolled in a finance program and learning the things my grandfather started teaching me when I was 9. That is the whole story. Now here is what I want to leave with you. The people who love you and the people who have a plan for you are not always the same people. Sometimes they are the same people, and the plan coexists with the love, and that is its own complicated truth. Sometimes the plan is what they have been building toward, and the love is the instrument they use to make the plan feel reasonable. The difference between those two situations is not always visible from inside them. What makes it visible is the question my grandfather taught me to ask. Not what do they want? What do they want it to cost me? When you can answer that question clearly and honestly, the rest becomes much simpler. Not easier, simpler, which is a different thing. The second thing, preparation is not paranoia. My grandfather did not teach me to distrust people. He taught me to understand systems, legal systems, financial systems, family systems. He taught me that understanding a system before you are inside a crisis is the only form of protection that actually works. Because inside the crisis, the understanding you did not build beforehand is the understanding you do not have. Build it before you need it. The third thing is the simplest and the one I think about most. He could have left me the money without the education. He chose to leave me the education alongside the money. That choice was the real inheritance. Everything else was just paperwork. If this story found you tonight, tell me in the comments. Tell me your first name and your city. Tell me if you have ever been the person in a room who was quieter than everyone else and more prepared than anyone knew. I want to know who is at this table. And if you want more stories like this one, visit our channel. Every story here is about someone who was underestimated and chose preparation over reaction. Someone who built something quietly while the room was looking elsewhere. Subscribe to Revenge Cold Stories. Come back for the next one.